Greetings, and welcome to this Roll for Crit review of My Father's Work from Renegade Game Studios. In this heavy story worker placement game, you play as a family of scientists trying to prove your genius over multiple generations through impressive experiments, scientific discovery, and maybe some more morally questionable acts. Now, unfortunately, all your work will happen next to a village, and those villagers won't always see eye to eye with you. So the question remains, will you be the one leading the village into the next generation, or are you going to earn the mad in Mad Scientist? Before we begin, we have to go over the app because this is a very heavy app-based game. This uses a story, almost best described as a choose-your-own-adventure, in which you choose one of 3 scenario boxes, and from there, depending on how you play the game and what story aspects you trigger, well, the app will have you go down different routes. Each of these packs will have multiple endings and with significant changes along the way, so you'll never know which one you're going to get, meaning there's going to actually be tons of playability and variety within each scenario. Starting up the app, you'll name the players at the table as well as the town. This will come up throughout the game, and in fact, whenever you complete an ending, if it involved a player or a town, it'll be recorded there. So keep that in mind when you try to decide what silly names your player as well as your town will have. Now, once you choose your scenario and get started, it will have a quick area where it'll have one part read out loud, but for the most part, you're going to be doing all the reading yourself.
Upon reaching the village, a foul stench tinged the air as teams of horses pulled the charcoal wagons like a silent funeral procession through the muddy streets.
The app will have multiple selections, usually asking you to click whenever you finish a round, or if you trigger certain events on the game board, which will be a perfect time for us to segue to the game board. Here are all your resources. Down there are cards for experiments. Here is the main village, as well as multiple tracks that you will be progressing or going down depending throughout the game, and your own personal estate. Now, I want to point out these little book tokens. Remember what I mentioned in the app? Well, anytime a token reaches there, that will usually mean you trigger an event within the app. Find out where it is, click it, and read what's going on. Keep in mind, some of these story events won't trigger right away. You won't know the results. Some of them could be random. Some of them may wait a generation first before you see the fruits or the negative outcomes of your labor, so you'll never know exactly what triggering a lot of these story events will cause for you. Now, the other big part of this game, besides the heavy story in the app, is worker placement. You will have multiple kinds of workers to place either in your personal estate or in the village. Let's quickly go over those workers because there's different kinds, and that dictates where they can go or what happens when they go in certain locations. First off, you have the basic servant. There are 2 in the game. They usually start in the Lost, and you can gain them throughout the game. These are basic sort of peons. They can go anywhere in the village. They can do estate actions, but however, some of them will drive them mad from seeing what terrible things you are doing within your home. That will usually cause them to be lost, but like I said, there are plenty of ways to hire most workers from the Lost. Next up, let's look at the worker with the round base but with bumps. This is the spouse. They work just like the basic servant. However, they have a special name and either abilities or the story app may refer to them. So always keep that in mind when and where you're placing them. Next, let's look at the caretaker. They have the square base. Apparently, they are so hideous that they're never allowed in the village. They can only do actions within your estate. That being said, they sort of know what's going on there. They're used to all your weirdness, so that won't make them run away. Finally, we have this one, and well, that's you. This represents you as the mad scientist, and you can go either in the estate or within the village. Now, the village, you get 2 great bonuses. First off, usually if you try to place in the same location as another piece, you have to spend a coin. But your own piece doesn't do that. They just push their way to the front of the line. They can go there, and in addition, any spot on the board, regarding some few exceptions, you will trigger twice if you go there. By the way, you may notice a bunch of different figures. The base is actually all that matters. You can swap out any of the miniatures included for whatever you like. In fact, I like to do that between generations. So maybe this is myself and my spouse, but the next generation, I don't know. Maybe this is what I think I look like. There's no reason to it. As long as you keep track of the bases, then everything else will be secured. This is the village board. This is where you're going to be placing a lot of workers, usually either interacting with a track or gaining resources. It's also where you can build a bunch of these rooms into your estate. We'll go over that when we enter the estate. For now, what you need to know is that there are different locations, but as the story progresses and depending on your choices, you may have to turn the page. Notice this is a book, and you'll have access to new buildings or maybe even lose access to some of them. Before we head to estate, let's talk about the creepy and insanity track. The creepy track tracks, well, how creepy you are. Each player has a token in their own color. Of course, like I mentioned, story beats can happen there, but there's also the village mob token here. It pretty much represents the people, well, being mad at you. If at any time you meet it or it passes you, you no longer have access to the village. The only location you'll have access to is the church, which is used to actually go back on the creepy track. So if you go behind the mob again, you now have access to the village. The sanity track is used to follow just how much sanity you're deciding to give up in the name of science. And it's not always that bad. Anytime your token hits this symbol, you will draw from the compulsion deck. These will have secret goals on them, usually asking for you to do a specific action. If you do so, you can reveal it and get the victory points. However, if you have too many of these at the end of a generation not completed, you will have to draw from the maladjustment deck. For future generations, you will have a negative ability, usually harming you in some way, and also giving negative points at the end of the game. There are also some other symbols as well, including going up on certain tracks, losing servants as they think you're too crazy to be around, and actually destroying your estate. Keep in mind for the final generation, you will actually flip this over into a different symbol, which is usually more punishing versus the previous one, meaning that you're not going to get as many compulsions and more ways for you to actually get some negative points. Now, let's move on to your estate. Here, this is where you'll be performing different experiments, recording your knowledge, and building up your keep. Let's start there because I mentioned that earlier with the village. That's where you place these tiles. They have a cost. You place them in these little slots, and that's for you building up and gaining more abilities and power, unlocking different rooms. Keep in mind, if you see those symbols, that means you'll be going up on those tracks each generation. Technically a penalty, depends what's going on. You will always start each generation with a spouse, yourself, and a caretaker. The big thing you're going to be doing is performing experiments. This is where you're going to get a ton of your points. Experiments are the cards here with different letters. They also come in different disciplines: chemistry, biology, engineering, and the occult. Now, most experiments will require some resources here, but there's also a bit of building on each other that's required as well. A experiments will only require very little resources, don't give too many victory points, and tend to give knowledge cubes. Now, a B experiment, on the other hand, will require not only those resources and give more points, but 1A to be completed. A C experiment will require much more resources, more points that actually vary depending on round, as well as 2 Bs to be completed. Finally, there is your piece de resistance. Each player gets one at the game randomly, so to speak. It's going to give a ton of points, but it's going to require 1A, 2 Bs, and 3 Cs to be done before you can attempt that experiment. It's worth a ton of points though, so it's really worth it to try and go for it. That said, there's a bit of a hiccup you'll have to watch out for when it comes to shifting generations. You see, a generation is made up of 3 rounds representing you aging, and when you go to a new generation, you actually lose a ton of stuff. You will lose any resources you have, and in terms of experiments completed, you only get to keep one of them, sliding it right under there. All other knowledge will be lost. This is extremely important as you have to choose carefully what you store in order to make sure you can get that full pyramid of experiments to complete your main goal. Now, there are some other ways for you to help the next generation in terms of leaving behind your legacy and helping them in their own scientific endeavors. This will go back to these knowledge cubes. They are used for experiments. However, as any good scientist knows, the difference between just messing around and science is taking notes. That is what this action is. Here, you will be spending these cubes to move up on the track matching that discipline. So for example, to move into this track, you need to spend 1. So this would cost 1 engineering cube. Going up here would cost 2 biology cubes. Finally, going into this spot, will cost you 3 chemistry. Now, there are 2 reasons why you're going to want to go up on this track. First up, there are the bonuses on the track. The first column doesn't have anything. Second one does have a unique bonus for each discipline. Third one will give you these red rooms. There's a pile in the corner for you to choose from. They tend to give lots of victory points. The other thing is it gives you a discount. Because you've recorded your knowledge for future generations, you will get a discount. So for example, this experiment, very expensive, requires 4 chemistry cubes. Because I'm on this slot, I get a discount of 3 cubes, meaning I would only need to spend 1 chemistry cube in addition to that. Now you may notice I haven't mentioned the occult yet. That's because occult's a little different. Occult's a little spooky. It's you going where humanity shouldn't go, so it acts a little differently, but it has a good reward. First off, it's got penalties going up the track, meaning it's going to harm you rather than help. In addition, anytime you use an occult, you will go up on the insanity track. You're going insane, going where your mind shouldn't go. So why would you use it? Well, first off, obviously some things may require it. Second off, let's say I didn't have that chemistry cube. If I have an occult cube, I can use an occult as a wild, be it an actual cube or here on the track. Meaning if I didn't even have this, because I have 1 on the occult track, that's a discount of 3 and 4. What's wrong with a little insanity in order to get that sweet discount? That is why you still would probably want to do some occult stuff, because it was really helpful as it helps pretty much all the other experiments. Just keep in mind that you might go just a bit too insane. And all these notes are permanent, so even after a generation ends and you lose all your resources, these will always stay where they are. What you've seen is pretty much what's going to be usually universal between each scenario. Now, each run is going to take over 3 generations, each generation 3 rounds, and during a round, you're going to be placing all the workers you have available to you, gaining some, possibly losing some, gaining resources, trying to gain those victory points usually through experiments, and at the end of the 3rd generation, hopefully your family branch was proven to be the best of them all. Now, there is going to be a lot of different story beats and events, which will depend on what you do, whether you hit some of those story tokens, whether you decide to perform specific actions, which will, of course, change up what you have available to you. In fact, this is a scenario box here like this. If I empty the contents out here, you'll see it comes with a ton of different things. You will not see most of these through one playthrough. Depending on the choices you make, you may only see 20% of what these tokens and cards do. So you'll never really know what you have in store for you, barring, of course, unless you've already played through every possible ending a scenario has to offer. Keep that in mind, and some of the things may feel a bit random. Other times, usually, I want to say around the end of the 2nd round, there's something they hint at like, keep in mind, the villagers want to have a vote or they're not feeling happy about something. So there are some hints of what you may want to focus in on between each generation and story rounds, depending on what's going on. That said, between the 3 of them, I don't feel it's as much of a difficulty. It felt more just like this is the sort of the starting point, and from there, just all the weird ways the stories can go. Speaking of which, the way the stories work is the first part's narrated, but the rest is not. I don't know whether that's them rushing the app. In fact, I was a little annoyed that the app did not come out with the game. I had to wait for it, or if that's what's going on, in which case I'd rather not have the voice acting. I can understand why they wouldn't, because there is a ton of text, which isn't too bad for me. I wish it was all voiced. It would be a little bit better, but you can have your characters voice it. There are times when you'll get a letter from your person, so it's sort of funny when you get to read it out loud. Granted, that's going to extend the time, which is going to be probably the biggest thing about this game. It is a pretty long game, even at the 2-player count, and that includes like reading all the stories. There is a way for you to save, but honestly, this game did not, at least the one time I used the same function, it didn't feel like there was a proper place where it splits equally, because there's only 3 generations. And you really want to split between generations, because that's when you lose and almost reset the board. I really feel like this is a game that should be played in one sitting. Unfortunately, that means you probably need to etch out at least 3 hours to give this game the time to breathe. Maybe if you're more experienced or do not have people who have any kind of analysis paralysis at the table, you got to know your group. That said, I will say that this game tricks you. You do not feel like you played through that full time. because they decided they weren't going to give up either mechanic or story, that you are always thinking what's going on. You have a strategy. It's not simply just leveling up a stat or just making an option A or option B choice, and maybe something that's a bit more just story heavy related is. At the same time, you have, while you're placing all these workers, the story isn't just the obvious like, oh, you saved Frankenstein's monster or you killed Frankenstein's monster. No, it's going to be a weird choice of dealing with the villagers and whether you agreed to help this person or not. And then 2 generations later, you're going to be like, oh, remember that choice you made before? Well, now you're going to be dealing with this kind of creature because you chose to do that. Or because you didn't invest early on in the biology experiments, because maybe it'll ask you like how many biology experiments you did. Well, then you unfortunately did not find a cure or something. There's so many weird things going on that I never felt like. There are plenty of board games and video games as well that tried to say, oh, we have all these great choice options, but really option A still leads to the same outcome as option B. It's more of like an illusion of choice, when this really feels like the branching does weird stuff that at the very least I cannot predict what's going to happen within the future lines of the game, which is pretty fun. And obviously having your named character and the named town really feels a bit more personal. Speaking of the story, one thing I do want to mention, which was, I feel it's more of a me thing, but the tone of the game is a little confusing for me. If you can't tell, the theme is gothic horror, very obvious. I mean, that's why I mentioned Frankenstein. But some of the events that came up, as well as especially the cards themselves, seem to be more humorous. I mean, you read some of those flavor texts in the cards, and don't get me wrong, I love silly flavor text, love me some goblins. But when you read some of them, it's like, hey, you know that reference, the internet from the movie or whatever, and it feels it's more comical, something more akin to Forgotten Waters, I feel. But then some of the story beats feel much darker, and that would be more akin to something like Mansions of Madness. And I feel while there is a way for you to mix two, and obviously it depends on your own preferences, for me, I feel it's not too far one direction or the other. I wish they went all in on a comedic, once again, Forgotten Waters style, or all in on dark and serious, which would be a bit more akin to something of the Lovecraftian games from Fantasy Flight. This is not something so bad that I think it pulls you out completely. It was just something weird that I noticed. It's just my own little preferences and stuff, but still I had a lot of fun finding out what was going on. Because like I said, the story beats are written well enough. They really wanted to write a novel here. There's so much going on that I honestly, after a few playthroughs, I wasn't trying to win, even though I would still try to get points and stuff. But I'd be like, what can I do to trigger that? Because I want to know what happens. And I really like that, because that takes you, for a story game at least, that takes you away from being like, all right, this is the winning strategy, to really delving and exploring what the game has to offer. And any good story game should make you want to explore or stay hooked to a character. In this case, the characters are you. So I really feel it's more about seeing what's happening and what's going to happen next. And it's really fun. And there are actually times where you'll actually be using these vote tokens. So you'll be voting with other players, maybe bidding against them for certain bonuses. So there is going to be tons of interactions. But at the same time, I don't feel there is a lot of hate playing. Like, you can block someone in the village, and if they don't have money, but you get money at the start of each round. It usually felt like it was you were never ruined from your strategy. Usually it was more of just you played with the cards you were dealt. And that pretty much, this is more of a preventing feel bads kind of thing, but I enjoyed it. And the worker placement, I really do love. Unlocking more of those workers, the different kinds of workers, and thinking, all right, if I place my guy here, this is the final generation, so I don't need to care about my servants because we reset always without servants. So I'm going to send them to do an experiment, which will make them go mad and leave, but that should be fine because I can then send my guy out into the village to get double resources. So there's all this, depending on the different workers you have and placing them in different places, the rooms will trigger different powers. For example, there's one that lets a caretaker go in the village. There's another one that makes it so your spouse doesn't leave like the servants. They can actually do experiments on their own just fine. So there are plenty of different strategies for you to go and feel like you're really growing up and becoming powerful and unlocking all these like little combos along the way. Track changes in the third round, as well as the rooms. Actually, there's a room stack of just 3s, which are specifically designed more for victory points in mind. It really feels like that almost the reason why it has that awkward game length of being a bit too long and not a great save point, and the tonal shifts as well, but that's just more preferences, that they didn't want to sacrifice either mechanic or story. They wanted a heavy story game that still has a lot of strategy and game mechanics to offer, rather than just sort of sacrificing on, which I think more games do. And if the price for that is a bit of a longer game that's maybe the length of a very long movie, well, I think I know what decision I'd make. Crits and misses for my father's work. Crits. This game is a fantastic mix of mechanics and story elements, with neither one being forced to be sacrificed for the other. There is plenty going on in the app story-wise, arguably almost a novel, with many different branches that are not the obvious lazy divides that you may see in some other choice-driven games. Meanwhile, on the mechanics side, there are plenty of different interesting workers with different styles and strategies, allowing you to customize them and unlock different powers. So you still feel like you're playing a heavy game rather than just reading along with the story with maybe some few basic clicks or fights along the way. I didn't mention it earlier, but you could obviously tell with all the pieces that everything is beautiful. This game is designed to make you feel like you're going the extra mile with everything, between glass jars and unique metal gears to having miniatures that are designed to slot into whichever base and ones you like. This is a game that wanted to make sure you felt like you paid for what you got, not only in a large app, but in tons of beautiful components. I want to point out in particular as its own crit, the story as well as the app, written in such a way that there are 24 endings between the 3 different scenario boxes, and the way that they're designed really felt like there's a lot of different things going on. Usually when I think of any video games or other board games that have stories and choices, sometimes it can feel a little bit lazy as the choice feels like it doesn't actually matter, or it's something so simple you know that the difference is going to be whether you kill or don't kill a final boss. This, I wasn't always sure, so I was always excited to explore and see what happened, and be it really creepy or really silly, it was always enjoyable to see what new event was on the horizon. Misses. This is 100% going to be a personal taste kind of feature, but I feel there's a bit of a tonal whiplash when it came to the story and mostly the experiment cards. Sometimes it wants to be really funny and cheeky, while other times it wants to be a bit more dark and serious. While I'm fine with the game being mostly humorous with a couple of more serious notes, such as Forbidden Waters, or on the other end, something that is mostly serious with maybe 1 or 2 small jokes in there, something more akin to Mansions of Madness series, this game felt like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be the actual Frankenstein novel or if it wanted to be the Young Frankenstein movie. This is a game that, in compared to many other story games, I don't feel it's long enough to want me to use the save function, but it's also definitely too long to be considered something you take off the shelf and maybe play on a whim during a game night. It is going to be something that you decide, I'm setting up a huge chunk for this game. Saving doesn't feel like it has a good place unless you've already played too much of the game or you've only played a very little bit. That being said, if you really just let this game have the time it needs to breathe, that be it 3, maybe even 4 hours if you're playing with 4 people, you're still going to usually have a great time with this and not notice the hours tick away. So you may have noticed my misses weren't really misses. That's because I feel, besides saying the game length is a little awkward for the saving, so you really got to plan out that time to sit down and play it, or of course the tonal shift, which is more of a me thing, most of its problems are just going to be things if you don't like. If you don't like heavy story and a lot of reading, this is going to have a lot of that. If you're not an app game fan, don't get this game. If you don't like worker placement, that's the core mechanic of the game. But if those aren't things that instantly turn you off, I cannot recommend this game more, especially for those of you who are story-heavy game players. If you like games such as Robinson Crusoe or Forgotten Waters, which I've been saying over and over, and as well as Mansions of Madness, Seventh Continent even, where you like exploring, seeing the world, knowing what's going on and wondering what's going to happen next, This game was designed for you in mind. And you're not going to feel like you're sacrificing an actual game for the sake of having an interesting story. There are so many fun things for you to do and fun, exciting moments when you're like, oh my God, if I do this, that gives me that extra discount and that gives me what I need and I can sacrifice this worker, but it'll be worth it to get this experiment. You're still going to be having fun strategizing while sitting in this fun, creative world, be it that has sometimes funny, sometimes some very dark moments. Overall, it's hard for me to find things wrong with this that I don't enjoy. It's a game that was designed pretty much for me in mind. It's got themes I like. It's got choices that matter, fun little mechanics going on that I'm building up on my own. It's very hard for you to feel bad because someone just keeps stealing stuff from you. You will feel like everything came down to your choices, not just because you happen to be third in line during placement order. And of course, the components, I mean, they wanted to make it worth its money. It is an expensive game. That's probably technically another miss, but at least they made it worth your while. And right now, I backed on Kickstarter because I thought they were actually only going to have it on Kickstarter. Luckily, they are still selling it on their site and possibly in a future Kickstarter. And we should keep an eye out for it because usually Kickstarters are a little bit cheaper and of course, new content. With all that said, I really hope if someone at Renegade is watching this, that you give this game as much love as you give the Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid. I like that game too, but it has a lot of expansions. And yes, the Power Ranger universe definitely offers that, but this game would too. You could easily send out new packs. I could see you reusing some of the different map packs from the book A if you want to just make a small expansion, or release 3 new different scenario boxes that come with their own book. There is so much fun stuff that you can do with this, and that's sticking with this theme. I could see this system being used for maybe if you wanted to do, instead of My Father's Work, go into maybe something like dystopian cyber future and doing different actions there. This system is so much fun. This is the kind of game that people like me who love heavy thematics want. They want to be able to have this fun story, feel like their choices matter, both in the story as well as in actual gameplay. This game gives that to you, and it's worth it in both the price and the time. But for now, I've got to get back to playing this game with my friends. Let me know what your thoughts on this game are. Do you feel like this game is a bit too much? Do you feel like I'm crazy for thinking about the tone and like it's perfectly fine what's going on? Do you feel like this is a game that Renegade should continue and other games should look to when they're trying to emulate that heavy story and gameplay mechanics style? I'd love to hear from you down below. Thank you so much for everyone who made it this far. And if you think someone would be interested in this game, and odds are there will be someone, please send them this video. And of course, do the usual stuff YouTube likes, the like, subscribe. We must build the algorithm experiment. But for now, I'm Will, and this has been Roll for Crit.